The December air was crisp and sharp as Princess Catherine stood before the towering Gothic arches of Westminster Abbey, her breath forming small clouds in the winter evening. The ancient stones of the cathedral seemed to glow with an ethereal light, illuminated by carefully placed spotlights that cast dramatic shadows across the medieval facade. This was no ordinary December evening in London. Tonight marked the 5th anniversary of her beloved Christmas carol service, an event that had grown from a simple idea into one of the most anticipated royal gatherings of the year. Catherine had arrived early, as was her custom, wanting to personally oversee every detail of the evening. She moved through the abbey with practiced grace, her burgundy coat trailing behind her as she checked with the event coordinators. The sound of her heels echoed softly against the stone floors as she walked through the nave, examining the massive Christmas tree that stood sentinel near the altar. The tree, a magnificent Norway spruce donated by the people of Oslo, reached toward the vaulted ceiling like a prayer made manifest in wood and needle. The idea for the carol service had come to Catherine 5 years earlier during a particularly challenging period for the royal family. She had been searching for a way to bring together communities that had shown extraordinary kindness and resilience during difficult times. The concept was simple yet profound. Create an evening where ordinary people who had done extraordinary things could come together with members of the royal family to celebrate the spirit of Christmas and the power of human connection. As Catherine walked through the abbey, she reflected on how the event had evolved. What had started as a modest gathering of perhaps 200 people had grown into a televised celebration that reached millions around the world. Yet despite its growth, she had insisted on maintaining its intimate character. Every invitation was personally meaningful, every guest chosen for their contribution to their community rather than their social status or celebrity. The guest list for tonight's service told stories of remarkable courage and compassion. There was Margaret Thompson, an 82-year-old woman from Yorkshire who had spent the past year organizing food deliveries for isolated elderly neighbors. She would be sitting just 3 rows from the front, wearing her best dress that she had carefully preserved for special occasions. Margaret had never imagined she would find herself in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by royalty and television cameras, simply because she had refused to let her neighbors go hungry. Near the back of the abbey would sit James Collins, a 28-year-old teacher from inner London who had transformed his struggling school by creating an after-school program that kept children off the streets and engaged them in learning. James had initially declined the invitation, feeling overwhelmed by the grandeur of the setting. It had taken 3 phone calls from Catherine's office to convince him that his work deserved this recognition. The evening's musical program had been carefully curated to blend traditional Christmas carols with contemporary pieces that spoke to modern themes of hope and community. The choir from St. Ray Martin in the Fields had rehearsed for weeks, their voices perfectly trained to fill every corner of the vast space. Catherine had specifically requested that they include Silent Night, sung in multiple languages, symbolizing the universal nature of the Christmas message and the diverse communities that would be represented in the congregation. As the afternoon progressed, Catherine made her way to the Lady Chapel, where she would have a few moments of quiet reflection before the guests began arriving. This had become her tradition over the 5 years of organizing the service. She would stand before the altar dedicated to the Virgin Mary and think about the people who would fill the pews in just a few hours. Each person represented a story of service, sacrifice, or simple human kindness that had touched lives in ways both large and small. The logistics of the evening were staggering, though Catherine had learned to delegate many of the operational details to her capable team. Security arrangements alone required coordination with multiple agencies. The abbey had to be swept twice, and discreet security personnel would be positioned throughout the building. Yet Catherine had insisted that the security presence remain invisible to the guests. She wanted people to feel welcomed and celebrated, not watched and monitored. The media attention surrounding the service had grown exponentially over the years. What had once been covered by a single BBC camera had expanded to include multiple television crews, photographers, and journalists from around the world. Catherine had learned to navigate this attention while keeping the focus on the guests and their stories rather than on herself. She had developed a particular skill for redirecting interview questions away from royal protocol and toward the work being done by the people she was honoring. One of the most challenging aspects of organizing the service each year was the selection process for guests. Catherine's office received thousands of nominations from community leaders, local officials, and ordinary citizens who wanted to recognize someone special in their lives. Each nomination was carefully reviewed, and Catherine herself read every single one. She often found herself moved to tears by the stories of sacrifice and service that arrived in her mail. This year's selection process had been particularly difficult because of the overwhelming response to global challenges. Healthcare workers who had risked their lives, teachers who had found innovative ways to reach their students, volunteers who had organized community support networks. The pool of deserving candidates seemed endless. Catherine had insisted on expanding the guest list slightly to accommodate more of these everyday heroes, even though it complicated the seating arrangements in the ancient abbey. The abbey itself held special significance for Catherine beyond its role as a venue for the carol service. She had walked down its aisle as a bride just over a decade earlier, watched by 2 billion people around the world. Tonight, she would process down that same aisle, but the focus would be entirely different. Instead of celebrating a royal wedding, the abbey would witness a celebration of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. As evening approached, Catherine returned to her private room in the abbey to make final preparations. Her outfit for the evening had been chosen with typical care, elegant enough to honor the solemnity of the setting, but not so formal as to overshadow her guests. She had selected a deep green dress that would photograph beautifully against the warm stone of the abbey walls, paired with jewelry that held personal significance rather than simply monetary value. The sound of the first cars arriving could be heard outside, and Catherine felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that preceded each year's service. In just a few minutes, she would greet her first guests personally at the abbey's great west door. This was another tradition she had maintained from the very first service, personally welcoming as many guests as possible before the service began. Margaret Thompson was among the first to arrive, looking slightly overwhelmed by the grandeur of her surroundings, but beaming with joy. Catherine spent several minutes talking with her about her work in Yorkshire, genuinely interested in the details of how Margaret had organized her volunteer network. These conversations were never rushed, despite the tight schedule of the evening. Catherine had learned that taking time to truly connect with her guests was more important than adhering rigidly to protocol. As more guests arrived, the abbey began to fill with an energy that was distinctly different from its usual solemn atmosphere. Children who had been helped by various charitable programs ran excitedly between the pews, their laughter echoing off the ancient stones. Elderly volunteers sat proudly in their finest clothes, many wearing medals or pins that recognized their years of service to their communities. The transformation of Westminster Abbey from a tourist destination to an intimate gathering place never ceased to amaze Catherine. The same building that housed the tombs of kings and queens, that had witnessed coronations and state funerals, was now filled with the authentic joy of people who rarely had their contributions recognized on such a grand scale. Television crews captured every moment, but Catherine had insisted on restrictions that would protect the dignity of her guests. No bright lights would shine directly on the congregation. No cameras would intrude on private moments of prayer or reflection. The coverage would focus on the service itself and the collective celebration rather than turning individual guests into unwilling celebrities. As the final guests took their seats, Catherine made her way to her own place in the abbey. She would sit not in a position of prominence, but among the congregation, emphasizing that this evening was about community rather than hierarchy. Prince William would join her shortly, along with their children, making this truly a family celebration of the values they hoped to instill in the next generation. The organ began its preliminary notes, filling the vast space with sound that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. Catherine looked around at the faces surrounding her, faces that told stories of resilience, compassion, and hope. In a world that often seemed dominated by division and despair, this gathering represented something different. It was a testament to the quiet heroism that existed in communities across the country, often unrecognized but never unimportant. Tonight, for 2 hours, Westminster Abbey would not be a museum or a tourist attraction. It would be what it was always meant to be, a place where people came together to celebrate something larger than themselves, to find comfort in community, and to remember that even in the darkest times, human kindness could still light the way forward. The great organ of Westminster Abbey swelled to life as the service officially began, its majestic tones washing over the assembled congregation like a warm embrace. Catherine felt the familiar rush of emotion that accompanied this moment each year, the culmination of months of planning and preparation, but more importantly, the beginning of an evening dedicated to celebrating the very best of human nature. Prince William took his place beside her, their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, settling into the pew with the kind of practiced dignity that came from years of public appearances. Yet tonight felt different from their usual royal engagements. There was an intimacy to this gathering, a sense that they were part of something larger than protocol and tradition. Catherine had specifically designed the service to feel like a community celebration rather than a formal royal event. The opening carol, "Once in Royal David's City," began with a single choir boy's voice piercing the silence of the abbey. The pure, clear notes seemed to float upward toward the vaulted ceiling before being joined by the full choir. Catherine watched as faces throughout the congregation lit up with recognition and joy. This was a carol that transcended social boundaries, sung in parish churches and cathedrals alike, familiar to everyone regardless of their background. Among the congregation, Margaret Thompson from Yorkshire wiped away a tear as the familiar melody transported her back to childhood memories of Christmas services in her local church. She had never imagined that her simple acts of kindness, delivering meals to elderly neighbors and organizing community support networks, would lead to this moment. Sitting in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by the great and good of the nation, she felt both humbled and proud. The service had been carefully structured to alternate between musical performances and readings that told stories of hope and resilience. Catherine had personally selected each element, working closely with the Dean of Westminster to create a program that would honor both the religious significance of Christmas and the secular spirit of community service that brought tonight's guests together. The first reading was delivered by Dr. Sarah Chen, a frontline healthcare worker who had volunteered at vaccination centers throughout the pandemic while maintaining her regular job at a London hospital. As she approached the lectern, her voice initially trembled with nervousness, but as she began reading from the Gospel of Luke, her words gained strength and clarity. The passage she had chosen spoke of bringing good news to the poor and freedom to the oppressed, themes that resonated deeply with her own experience of serving vulnerable communities. Catherine watched Dr. Chen with admiration, remembering their conversation during the pre-service reception. Sarah had spoken passionately about her work with refugee communities, describing how she had helped establish mobile health clinics that brought basic medical care to people who might otherwise go without. Her dedication had cost her financially and personally. She had taken unpaid leave from her regular position to volunteer full-time during critical periods of the health crisis. The musical program continued with a performance by the London Community Gospel Choir, a group that Catherine had discovered during one of her visits to inner-city community centers. Their powerful rendition of "Mary Had a Baby" brought a distinctly contemporary energy to the ancient setting. The rhythmic clapping and swaying that began in the choir spread throughout the congregation, creating a moment of pure joy that television cameras captured but could barely convey to viewers at home. In the third row, James Collins, the teacher from inner London, found himself clapping along enthusiastically. He had been nervous about attending such a formal event, worried that he wouldn't know how to behave in such grand surroundings. But the warmth of the music and the evident pleasure of the other guests had put him at ease. He thought about his students, many of whom came from communities similar to those represented by tonight's performers, and felt proud that their stories were being honored in this magnificent setting. Catherine had insisted that each year's service include voices from different faith traditions, reflecting the diverse religious landscape of modern Britain. This year, Rabbi Rebecca Goldstein from Manchester delivered a reading from the Hebrew Bible that spoke of justice and compassion. Her presence in the Abbey represented Catherine's commitment to making the service truly inclusive, recognizing that the values being celebrated, kindness, service, sacrifice for others, transcended religious boundaries. The children's choir from St. Bartholomew's Primary School in Birmingham took their place near the altar for their performance of Silent Night in multiple languages. Catherine had specifically requested this multilingual version after visiting the school and learning about its incredibly diverse student body. Children with roots in Somalia, Bangladesh, Poland, and dozens of other countries had worked together to learn the beloved carol in their families' native tongues. As the familiar melody began in English, other languages gradually joined in: Arabic, Urdu, Mandarin, Spanish, and more. The effect was hauntingly beautiful, a reminder that the message of Christmas spoke to people across all cultural and linguistic boundaries. Catherine noticed tears in many eyes throughout the congregation as parents and grandparents heard their native languages echoing through the historic abbey. Prince Louis, the youngest of Catherine's children, listened with wide-eyed wonder as the different languages swirled around him. At 7 years old, he was beginning to understand that his family's role involved meeting people from many different backgrounds and cultures. Tonight's service provided a perfect example of how diversity could create something more beautiful than any single voice alone. The service's centerpiece was a special commissioning ceremony for community volunteers. Catherine had worked with religious leaders from various traditions to create a blessing that would honor the work these individuals did in their daily lives. One by one, representatives from different types of service organizations came forward: food bank coordinators, youth mentors, elderly care volunteers, environmental activists, and literacy tutors. Among those called forward was Ibrahim Hassan, a refugee from Somalia who had arrived in Britain 10 years earlier speaking no English. Through determination and the help of volunteer tutors, he had not only learned the language but had gone on to establish a nonprofit organization, helping other refugees navigate the complex process of building new lives in a foreign country. As he stood before the altar of Westminster Abbey, he thought about the volunteer English teacher who had first helped him, wondering if she could have imagined that her student would one day be honored in such a place. The blessing ceremony was deeply moving, with each volunteer receiving a small wooden cross carved from timber taken from the Abbey's medieval roof during recent restoration work. Catherine had suggested this gesture, wanting to give each honoree something that connected them permanently to this evening and to the historic significance of the building where their service was being recognized. Dr. Elizabeth Murray, a retired teacher who had spent her retirement years establishing reading programs in underprivileged schools, felt the weight of the small cross in her palm and marveled at the journey that had brought her here. She had started her volunteer work simply because she loved books and wanted to share that passion with children who might not otherwise have access to quality literature. The idea that this quiet work would eventually lead to recognition at Westminster Abbey had never occurred to her. The musical program resumed with a performance by Gareth Williams, a young man from Wales whose community had been devastated by the closure of local industries. Instead of leaving for opportunities elsewhere, Gareth had stayed to establish a music program that gave local children alternatives to unemployment and despair. His arrangement of The Holly and the Ivy incorporated traditional Welsh harmonies with contemporary elements, creating something both ancient and modern. Catherine watched Gareth's performance with particular interest, remembering her visit to his small town in the Welsh valleys. She had seen firsthand how his work was transforming a community, giving young people skills, confidence, and hope for the future. The town's youth orchestra, which Gareth had built from nothing, now performed regularly throughout Wales and had even been invited to play at the National Eisteddfod. As the service moved toward its conclusion, Catherine reflected on how each year's gathering seemed to take on its own unique character. This 5th anniversary felt especially significant, marking the transition of the carol service from an experimental idea into an established tradition. The consistency of the format provided comfort and familiarity, while the changing faces and stories kept each year fresh and meaningful. The final musical selection was O Holy Night, performed by Maria Santos, a single mother from East London who had discovered her extraordinary singing voice while performing in community centers during lockdown. Her rendition was breathtaking, her powerful voice filling every corner of the Abbey with pure emotion. Maria had supported her family by cleaning offices at night while caring for her disabled son during the day, but she had never let circumstances diminish her commitment to bringing music to her community. As Maria's voice soared through the ancient arches, Catherine noticed that the entire congregation had fallen into complete silence, captivated by the beauty and power of the performance. This was exactly what she had hoped to achieve with the carol service. Moments when the artificial barriers between people dissolved, when shared human experience created connection across all differences of background and circumstance. The service concluded with the entire congregation joining in, "Hark, the herald angels sing," their combined voices creating a joyful noise that seemed to make the very stones of the Abbey vibrate with life. Catherine sang along enthusiastically, her clear voice blending with those of her family and the hundreds of guests who had made this evening possible through their daily acts of service and compassion. As the final notes faded away, Catherine felt the deep satisfaction that came from seeing a vision successfully realized. The 5th annual Christmas Carol service had achieved everything she had hoped for. It had honored deserving individuals, brought diverse communities together, and created a celebration that lifted spirits while recognizing the best aspects of human nature. The recessional began with Catherine and her family leading the way out of the Abbey, but this was not a formal royal departure. Instead, they moved slowly through the congregation, stopping to chat with guests, to take photographs, and to share personal moments of connection that would be treasured long after the television cameras stopped rolling. The warmth of the reception following the carol service created a striking contrast to the crisp December evening outside Westminster Abbey. Catherine had insisted on hosting this gathering in the Abbey's historic Jerusalem chamber, where centuries of significant meetings had taken place, but tonight it would witness something entirely different. Ordinary people being treated with extraordinary respect and genuine appreciation. The chamber, with its medieval wooden beams and stone walls, had been transformed for the evening with carefully arranged lighting that created intimate conversation areas throughout the space. Catherine moved through the room with practiced grace, but her interactions were anything but formal. She had learned over 5 years of hosting these events that the real magic happened not during the televised service, but in these quieter moments afterward when she could truly connect with her guests. Margaret Thompson from Yorkshire stood near one of the tall windows, still somewhat overwhelmed by the events of the evening. She was examining the ancient tapestries that lined the walls when Catherine approached, carrying 2 cups of tea. The simple gesture immediately put Margaret at ease. Here was the future queen, personally serving her refreshments, rather than expecting to be waited upon. Their conversation revealed the depth of Margaret's commitment to her community. During the past winter, she had noticed that several elderly neighbors were struggling with isolation and food insecurity. Rather than simply feeling sorry for them, Margaret had organized a network of volunteers that delivered not just meals, but companionship and practical support. Her initiative had grown to serve over 200 people across 3 villages, operating entirely through word of mouth and the goodwill of local residents. Catherine listened intently as Margaret described the challenges of coordinating volunteers, finding reliable transportation, and ensuring that help reached the people who needed it most. The princess asked detailed questions about logistics and funding, demonstrating a genuine understanding of the practical difficulties involved in grassroots community work. Margaret later told friends that Catherine had treated her like a valued consultant rather than a charity case, seeking advice about how similar programs might be established in other areas. Across the room, Dr. Sarah Chen was engaged in animated conversation with James Collins, the teacher from Inner London. Despite their different professional backgrounds, they had discovered surprising parallels in their work. Both had identified critical needs in their communities and had developed innovative solutions without waiting for official support or recognition. Their discussion about sustainable funding for community programs had drawn several other guests into their circle, creating an impromptu networking session. James described his after-school program that combined academic support with practical life skills training. What had started as simple homework help had evolved into a comprehensive program that taught everything from basic cooking and financial literacy to conflict resolution and career planning. The program now served over 300 children annually, with a waiting list that stretched for months. Dr. Chen shared her experience establishing mobile health clinics in underserved communities. She had recognized that many people faced transportation barriers that prevented them from accessing basic health care, so she had organized teams of volunteer medical professionals who brought services directly to housing estates, community centers, and places of worship. Her clinics had provided care to thousands of people who might otherwise have gone without medical attention. Catherine found these spontaneous conversations among her guests to be one of the most rewarding aspects of the evening. She had hoped that bringing together people doing similar work in different communities might lead to collaboration and mutual support. But she had been delighted to discover that it also created inspiration and renewed motivation for their ongoing efforts. Prince William joined a group that had formed around Ibrahim Hassan, the Somali refugee who had established a non-profit organization. Ibrahim was describing the complex challenges faced by newly arrived refugees: language barriers, unfamiliar bureaucratic systems, cultural adjustment, and often the trauma of their experiences before reaching safety. His organization had developed a comprehensive support system that addressed all these needs through a combination of professional services and peer support. William was particularly interested in Ibrahim's educational programs for refugee children, asking thoughtful questions about how schools could better support students who had experienced displacement and trauma. Ibrahim's responses revealed both the resilience of refugee communities and the critical importance of early intervention and culturally sensitive support. The conversation attracted several teachers and social workers who were eager to learn from Ibrahim's experience and expertise. Young Gareth Williams from Wales found himself the center of attention as people asked about his music programs for at-risk youth. His approach was holistic, combining musical training with academic support, career guidance, and community service projects. Students in his programs not only learned to play instruments, but also developed leadership skills, cultural awareness, and pride in their local heritage. Gareth explained how music had provided a common language that transcended the social and economic divisions in his community. Young people who might never have interacted otherwise found themselves working together in orchestras and bands, building friendships and mutual respect. Parents who had been skeptical of the program had become its strongest advocates after seeing positive changes in their children's behavior, academic performance, and future aspirations. Catherine moved through these conversations like a skilled diplomat, but her engagement was deeply personal rather than merely professional. She asked follow-up questions that demonstrated she had been listening carefully, and she offered insights drawn from her years of visiting communities across the country. Her genuine curiosity about the work being done by her guests created an atmosphere where people felt comfortable sharing both their successes and their challenges. The evening's most moving moment came when Maria Santos, who had performed "O Holy Night" during the service, was approached by several other guests who shared their own stories of finding strength through music during difficult times. Maria's journey as a single mother supporting a disabled child while pursuing her passion for singing had resonated with many people in the room who had faced their own struggles with balancing personal dreams and practical responsibilities. Dr. Elizabeth Murray, the retired teacher who had established reading programs, found herself in deep conversation with several parents about the importance of early literacy intervention. Her programs had demonstrated remarkable success in improving reading skills among children who had been falling behind in traditional classroom settings. The key, she explained, was individualized attention and making reading fun rather than treating it as a chore. Elizabeth's approach involved pairing struggling readers with volunteer tutors who focused as much on building confidence as on developing skills. Many of her students had never owned their own books before joining the program, and she had established a system where children could earn books to take home permanently. The pride and excitement she had witnessed when children realized they could keep their favorite stories had convinced her that access to books was as important as access to instruction. As the evening progressed, Catherine noticed that the formal barriers that often existed at royal events had completely dissolved. Her guests were treating each other as equals, sharing experiences and advice with the kind of openness that typically developed only after long acquaintance. The setting might have been grand and historic, but the atmosphere was warm and inclusive. The conversations revealed common themes that transcended the specific types of service being provided. Nearly everyone spoke about the satisfaction that came from seeing positive changes in their communities, but they also acknowledged the emotional toll of working with people facing serious challenges. Many had struggled with questions about sustainability and scalability, how to maintain their programs without burning out personally, and how to expand their impact without losing the personal touch that made their work effective. Catherine found herself serving as an informal facilitator, introducing guests who were working on similar issues and encouraging collaboration. She had learned that some of the most valuable outcomes of the carol service occurred not during the public event itself, but through the relationships and partnerships that developed among her guests. The technical crew had long since finished packing up their equipment, and the last television interview had been completed hours earlier. Yet the gathering in the Jerusalem chamber continued, sustained by the genuine enthusiasm of people who rarely had opportunities to share their experiences with others who truly understood their work. As the evening finally began to wind down, Catherine made sure to spend individual time with guests who had seemed particularly moved by the evening's events. She had learned that for many people, being recognized in such a public way could be overwhelming, and she wanted to ensure that everyone felt supported and celebrated rather than simply exhibited. Margaret Thompson was among the last to leave, clutching a small gift bag that contained a photograph from the service and a handwritten thank you note from Catherine. As she prepared to return to Yorkshire, Margaret reflected that the evening had given her something she hadn't expected. Not just recognition for her work, but validation that what she was doing mattered beyond her small community. The journey home for most guests would be long, but the memories and connections made during this 5th anniversary carol service would last much longer. Catherine's vision of bringing together unsung heroes from across the country had succeeded in creating something beautiful and meaningful, a celebration that honored both individual achievement and collective commitment to making the world a better place. As Westminster Abbey returned to its quiet nighttime dignity, Catherine took a final walk through the now empty nave. The Christmas tree still stood illuminated near the altar, its lights reflecting off the ancient stones and stained glass windows. In a few hours, the Abbey would welcome its usual stream of tourists and worshippers, but tonight it had been something special, a place where ordinary people had been recognized for extraordinary service. The success of the 5th annual Christmas Carol service had exceeded even Catherine's hopes. It had become more than a seasonal celebration. It had evolved into an institution that annually renewed faith in human goodness and reminded everyone present that positive change was possible when people committed themselves to serving others. Looking ahead to future services, Catherine was already thinking about how to reach even more deserving individuals and communities. The challenge would be maintaining the intimate character that made the event special while expanding its impact and influence. But tonight, surrounded by the echoes of beautiful music and meaningful conversation, that seemed like a wonderful problem to have. The carol service had demonstrated once again that when people came together in the spirit of service and celebration, something magical occurred. Barriers dissolved, connections formed, and hope flourished. In a world often dominated by division and despair, Westminster Abbey had witnessed a powerful reminder that human kindness remained alive and strong, lighting the way forward for communities across the nation.